Hello, my name's Barry Hurd. In this documentary we shall be looking at many rare vintage and veteran motorcycles here at the Dorset Steam Fair and at the National Motorcycle Museum near Birmingham. Here in the museum we shall be looking at and talking about such priceless old machines such as this. This is the 1913 Abingdon 696cc V-twin. They were often nicknamed King Dick, and I shall explain why later in the programme. And this is another machine we shall be looking at in more detail later on. This is the 1902 Excelsior, built in Coventry by the company called Bayliss & Thomas. Another fascinating motorcycle, here's the 1903 Kerry. Early Kerry machines, it's believed, were built in Belgium for the East London Rubber Company, who distributed them in this country. This is the 1912 New Imperial with a 500cc JAP or JAP engine. JAP stands for J.A. Prestwick of Tottenham, London, who were leaders in building V-twins at the time. And just to finish whetting your appetite of what treasures the National Motorcycle Museum has to offer, here we have a Torpedo. Many other countries produce motorcycles with the name Torpedo. This one is of course British, built in Lincolnshire by the company F. Hop & Co.
Thank you very much.
Back in Dorset, we shall also be able to see many more fine examples of classic British motorcycles, like this Douglas.
Field there, top end of the arena field.
But first we will go back to the National Motorcycle Museum and begin by looking at the rare old machines in the exhibition there, starting with this 1902 Excelsior. Bayliss & Thomas, who produced this machine, are generally considered as being the oldest motorcycle manufacturer in the country. They were situated in Coventry, which at the end of the 19th century was at the heart of British pedal bike production and was the ideal site for the emerging motorcycle industry. The first powered two-wheelers produced by Bayliss & Thomas went on the market in 1896 using a 1¼ horsepower single-cylinder Minerva engine. However, this 1902 Excelsior has an engine made under a De Dion licence by the British Motor Traction Co Limited. De Dion electric ignition is fitted to this machine, the battery and coil being carried in a compartment of the fuel tank and the contact breaker being conventionally driven from the timing gear. Fuel supply is by surface carburettor to the automatic inlet valve, and engine lubrication is by hand pump, the oil tank being mounted under the saddle. Although this machine was reputed to have been very reliable for its time, it apparently was very uncomfortable and its brakes were hopeless and often fell off. We shall be looking at another machine from the Bayliss & Thomas stable later. Next, we are going to look at this 1903 Kerry. Kerry machines were produced over three distinct periods, the first generation being between 1902 and 1910. These were built in Belgium for the East London Rubber Co, who distributed them in this country. They were normally fitted with Kellycom or FN engines, but a rare illustration does exist where a model was fitted with the 1½ horsepower Kerry engine. The Kerry was soon to gain a good reputation for strength, reliability and speed. An early advertisement claimed that a Kerry was the first to arrive at the MCC Brighton run held on the 7th of March 1903. The second generation of Kerrys was produced between 1910 and 1915 by Abingdon, and the last was in the 1950s when the name Kerry reappeared on a 49cc moped. This 1903 2½ horsepower model would have cost about £40 new. Another early British motorcycle to come onto the market, this time in 1900, was the Ormond. These machines were powered by a Kellycom engine mounted in a frame built by Taylor Goo Limited. By 1904, the year this machine was manufactured, Ormonds were already in financial trouble and they were taken over by the aforesaid Taylor Goo. But although the original Ormond company only lasted a few years, its conception was responsible for one of the most famous motorcycle marques in British motorcycle history. For John Taylor, Taylor Gu, was really Johannes Gutschermann, a German who settled in Birmingham in 1884, assuming the name Taylor to avoid German national service. Taylor's first step into immortality in motorcycle history was to come up with a new and more exciting name for their machines. He came up with the name Veloz, shortened from the word velocity. This the company adopted. But all was not smooth going for Taylor. As like Ormond's, Taylor Gu also got in financial trouble and were forced into bankruptcy. Taylor was obviously undaunted by this setback, for he carried on making bicycles still under the name Veloz. Then, in 1910, when his two sons joined him in the firm, he resumed making motorcycles. There are two more major name changes to come in this story, one in 1913, another in 1917. First, let me tell you about the one in 1917. Taylor, after taking British citizenship, changed his name to Goodman. But more importantly, 4 years earlier in 1911, after his company had produced a new 206cc twin, he wanted a new name for it, and the name Velocette was chosen. This name, of course, proved so popular, eventually the company was called after it. And that is the major contribution that Ormond made to British motorcycle history. In making this programme, I wanted to find some really rare motorcycles, and I don't think you can find many rarer than this one. This Lloyd Thomas was produced by an obscure Welsh engineer around 1906, and it is believed this one is the last remaining example of the breed. It is hard to find any reference to the Lloyd Thomas in any motorcycle handbook, yet in 1962 this machine did achieve its 15 minutes of fame when it was ridden from London to Brighton in the Sunbeam Club Run, and it got a first class award in the Banbury Run. In the latter, the petrol tank split and it was apparently repaired with chewing gum. The Lloyd Thomas has been described as a monster to ride. It is tall, and its riders by necessity need to be long-legged and quite athletic, to frequently pedal assisting the engine on hills. The maker's handbook said light pedal assistance might be necessary, but this was definitely an understatement, as it was often hard work. The engine is a mystery. It has no maker's name or number, and it is of no recognisable design. It is thought it could be French, but nobody knows for sure. So there you have it, the Lloyd Thomas, and very rare it is too. Now let's go back to the Dorset Steam Fair and that Douglas. Douglas was a remarkable company that went through many highs and lows during its 50 years of production. The motorcycle you're looking at now is one of two Douglas Dispatch rider bikes here at the fair. This one was manufactured in 1915, the other in 1923. Production of this machine actually started in 1914, and between then and 1918 over 25,000 were produced for the armed forces fighting the First World War. Its engine of 2 3/4 horsepower was powerful enough for pedals to be done away with at last, and it could reach a respectable top speed of 50 miles per hour. Douglas machines held many world records at various times during their production. Douglas also gained the coveted by appointment endorsement when Prince Albert, later George VI, purchased one of their machines. Another milestone was in 1922 when the Douglas 500 was first to break the 100 miles per hour barrier in this country. This is a much later model. It's the T35 Mark I, and this one was manufactured in 1947. It was hoped that this motorcycle would change the flagging luck of the Douglas company, but although it created a lot of interest, it failed to attract sales. It was thought to be overpriced, and like many other Douglas machines before it, it proved to be a little unreliable. This 350 has a boxer engine and the cylinders are mounted across the frame in BMW style. Douglas finally ceased production of motorcycles in 1957. Conceived by an American designer called Carl Neeracar, this weird-looking 1921 machine is actually called a Neeracar. Initially it was built in the USA from 1921 to 1923. Later it was licensed to the British firm Sheffield Simplex of Kingston-on-Thames, where production carried on from 1923 to 1927. As you can see, the seat is low and the rider assumes an unusual sitting position behind the large front mudguard. The crankshaft is housed in a low pressed steel frame, and the handlebars have a linkage to connect them to the steering. Initially its power came from a 221cc two-stroke engine. Later this was increased to a 350cc four-stroke single. Sales of the nearer car were never world stopping, and in 1927, when financial troubles overcame Sheffield Simplex, production of this unusual machine came to an end. This is a 1904 Quadrant 3 horsepower. An early Quadrant advert read, "Britain's oldest motorcycle, best in 1900 and foremost ever since." Luckily for W.J. Lloyd, who ran Quadrant, a far more liberal attitude was exercised over false claims at the time. For in fact the first Quadrant did not appear on the market until 1901, and both Ariel and Excelsior had bikes already on sale well before then. There, as it happens, was no real reason for the company to try and exaggerate their claims to the Quadrant, as it certainly proved itself in 1903 when a machine like this one was ridden by John Silver, a long-distance trail rider, from Land's End to John O'Groats. It was the first time this journey was officially timed, and he did the distance in 64 hours 29 minutes. Quadrant remained in business until 1927. In 1910, Kirby and Edwards of Lincoln produced this 499cc Lincoln Elk. It is said there is nothing memorable about this motorcycle but its name, and I must agree there is certainly nothing unusual or different about it, being a conventional design for the time, and it was not fast or graceful as the name Elk suggested. Kirby and Edwards had made pedal cycles for many years before they began to produce motorcycles in 1902. They felt they needed a catchy name for their machines, and whoever thought of the name Lincoln Elk certainly came up with the winner, as apparently it created a lot of interest in their machines from the very beginning. Unusually, the simple side valve engine was at least produced by the company, unlike many of the other new manufacturers who brought power plants in from outside, often from abroad. As at the turn of the 20th century there was no such thing as production lines, machines were mostly made to order. Today no records of Kirby and Edwards' business ventures still exist, so it is impossible to say how successful the Lincoln Elk was, but we know production continued till 1924.
Well, we're coming on now to number 16. This time we got a Triumph Ricardo 1923 500cc. Owned by John Keaton from Seven Oaks in Kent. Another beautiful old flat tanker there. Lovely old vintage machine.
Shortly after the First World War, Sir Henry or Harry Ricardo, who was an expert with all things mechanical, was asked by Triumph to design them a new engine to replace their old and trusted side valve power plant. After experimenting with various alternatives, Triumph was at last able to announce that their new model would use a 4-valve head design. However, the remainder of the engine was virtually identical to the Triumph Model H. With its 499cc capacity and 3-speed gearbox, the Ricardo, or Ricky as it was affectionately known, had a top speed of 70 miles per hour. Production, which started in 1921, was to go on until 1928. This is a 1920 Nutt model V998cc. Nutt was an acronym of Newcastle upon Tyne, where production of this new range began in 1911. Being soundly financed from the beginning, early machines were soon being entered into competitions, and in 1913 Hugh Mason won the Junior TT, even though he'd had a serious accident in practice. The company had used Jap engines exclusively in 1913, and the one Mason had won with was a 345cc twin. Up to and during the First World War, Nutt went on expanding their range of twins, and by 1916 they could boast machines from 2 3/4 right up to 8 horsepower. After the war, Nutt started to manufacture their own engines with Sturmey Archer gearboxes. However, after a move and the loss of financial backing, the range was reduced to one 700cc model, which was nevertheless available in several specifications. Well, in the time I've had available here, I've managed to cover the period of time when this bike was actually produced. It is only left for me to say that Nutt went on producing motorcycles with varying success until 1933, when low sales figures and increasing costs finally put the company out of business. Here we have another rare motorcycle. This is a 1909 4.5 horsepower Brown, built by Brown Brothers of London. This bike has an interesting history, which I will have to shorten quite a bit owing to the lack of time available. Its first owner was a German who just before the First World War went back to Germany, leaving this motorcycle here in England. It was soon commandeered by the police, who in the end didn't use it very much, probably because it doesn't have gears or a clutch. It was to remain in the hands of the authorities until 1930, when I assume it was at last accepted its German owner was not going to come back and reclaim it. It was at this time a garage foreman took possession of it, and he with the garage owner rode it in the first few MCC Pioneer runs from London to Brighton. The machine then changed hands again, and in a part exchange deal Ted Taylor acquired it. He was to ride it another 43 times in the Pioneer run, and in 1987, on its 47th outing in the event, this motorcycle received the Golden Jubilee Award for competing a record amount of times. After Ted Taylor's death, this Brown was auctioned and it was sold for an incredible £11,000. But as it's believed to be the last Brown in existence and it has a rare number plate H2350, I guess it was really a bargain. An unusual superstition grew in the motorcycle industry. That was that it was considered unlucky to use the word new in a name. 12 firms did, and all were to succumb to misfortune. The longest lived British motorcycle to sport the name New was the New Imperial. The company began production in 1903 and carried on till 1939, when plans to continue under new ownership was halted by the beginning of the Second World War. This model was manufactured in 1912 and has a 500cc Jap engine and belt drive. George Townsend & Co was a small firm near Redditch that manufactured needles. But like so many other companies at the time, they got involved in the growing cycle industry, and by 1890 they were making their own machines. And because the company had contacts with the armament factory at Enfield, Middlesex, they chose Enfield for their brand name. Later, in 1896, a new company was formed called the New Enfield Cycle Co., and a year later this was changed to the Royal Enfield Cycle Co. In 1910 they started to produce V-twins, and by 1914 they produced this 3 horsepower model. We shall be looking at more Royal Enfields later.
Coming on now to number 13, this time we got the old Rally, 1922, 2 3/4 horsepower, owned by Jeremy Lyle from Watford in Somerset. Comes every year, thank you very much sir, nice all. Names that are gone from a lot of us, another rare old machine.
You've just seen the 1922 2 3/4 horsepower Rally, and here we have another. This one's a 1929 model. Rally was another firm that built bicycles before motorcycles, and the latter it started to manufacture in 1901. But even after GP Mill set a remarkable new record riding a Rally from Land's End to John O'Groats in 51 hours, in 1906 the firm abandoned production of motorcycles for a few years owing to lack of sales. Production began again in 1920, and during that decade the 2 motorcycles we've seen here today were produced. Ever keen to demonstrate their new range before the press, to show their reliability, they sent a combination around the coast in one direction while Marjorie Cotterill, riding a single, travelled around the other way. But by 1933 sales were not impressive, and once more Rally ceased motorcycle production. They tried one last time in 1958 with a 49cc moped, but again after various changes sales were not sufficient for them to carry on, and in 1971 Rally stopped motorcycle production altogether.
That little Firefly Vincent, 48cc, 1953. Morning, Jeff. That's Jeff Hart.
This is a 1922 Wolf Model C 2 3/4 horsepower machine. Wolverhampton was the home of the Wolf, and they stayed in production with only one short break from 1901 to 1939. There was a wide range of machines available, with engines from 100 to 750cc. Early models had engines supplied by Motto, Reeve, Blackburn, Jap, Pico, Villiers, etc. However, after their short break in production, later machines mostly used 250cc 2-stroke Villiers engines.
'24 Rover Sport 500 owned by Jim Bowles from Ron. Morning, Jim. Beautiful old original Rover there. Comes every year. Been in the family since new. Number 20, owned by Robin Dodd from Derby. From 550, owned by John Dennis from Exmouth down in Devon. Absolutely original, that old machine is. Very nice, John. Thank you.
Here we have another Excelsior. This one was manufactured in 1903, a year after the one we saw earlier. Its drive comes from a small 211cc engine, but again we must remember how bikes like this one revolutionised travel in its day, 100 years ago. This 500cc motorcycle was manufactured in 1906 by a London firm called the Imperial Motor Company. There is no connection with the Birmingham firm called New Imperial. The surprising thing about this bike is that on the rear wheel it has a disc brake assisting the more conventional braking system. This disc brake is more or less exactly the same as the brakes used today, except it's operating mechanically. Hydraulics had yet to be invented. Imperial stopped production in 1910, and whoever invented and developed the disc brake used by them is, as far as I know, a mystery. This 4 horsepower White Heather is a survivor from a period when assembly machines were popular. On the fuel tank is the name Macintosh Coventry, who built this machine and did so, I'm told, from various boxes of components. For example, the 4 horsepower side valve engine is a Belgian manufacture by V. Antony Fil of Liège. The frame fittings and front forks were supplied by Chatterley, and the magneto was from Bosch. This White Heather, so I believe, is the last one remaining, and its age is unknown. Throughout its long history, Triumph has often produced market leaders, and I think I can say that in 1908 this 500cc model was just that. For their first machines, Triumph used other companies' engines, but from 1905 they started to use their own, and they rapidly gained a reputation for speed and reliability. Other features of this machine are handlebar controls and spring forks. Another masterpiece to come from the Triumph factory was the Speed Twin. Designed by Edward Turner in the late 1930s, the Speed Twin put Triumph right out in front of its competitors again, forcing them to build parallel twins of their own. It was a brave gamble by Triumph, as singles had dominated the market for several decades, but it certainly paid off. The Speed Twin was so successful it dominated Triumph sales for over 40 years. Most of the motorcycles we have seen so far were made on benches, the earlier ones often only to order. I had the opportunity recently to visit the new Triumph factory at Hinckley, where I was able to take some shots of the production line, and for the next few minutes I am going to give you the opportunity to see how modern motorcycles are manufactured.
Thank you very nice old Sunbeam there.
Back in Dorset, here we have a 1925 500cc Model 3 Sunbeam. The Sunbeam company that began motorcycle manufacturing in 1912 sprung from a firm called Sunbeam Land, and Sunbeam Land could trace its antecedents back to 1790 as Marston's Limited. John Marston's, whose decision it was to start this new venture, was 14 years behind another member of his family who in 1898 had started Villiers Engineering. The first Sunbeams were finished in black with a 9-layer weatherproof coating developed by Marston's for a metal lacquering treatment for kitchen utensils. Sunbeam began to enter competition shortly after production began, and the firm had its first success in 1914, coming joint second in the Isle of Man TT. During the First World War, Sunbeam, like so many other companies, received orders supplied by to the armed forces. Then, in 1918, on the death of John Marston, the company was sold to ICI. In the 20s, more successes were achieved in competition, not only in this country but in Europe as well, but the 30s and 40s were to bring changes. Firstly, the company was sold to Matchless, then again in 1943 to BSA. After the Second World War, BSA was unable to profit from Sunbeam's reputation, and so in 1964 the name Sunbeam eventually disappeared from the market. Now we come to a motorcycle from the Scott Squirrel range. This is a 1926 498cc 2-speed Scott Super Squirrel. Can we say Alfred Angus Scott was a genius? I think we can, for he was one of the great innovators of the early years of motorcycling. After all, it was he who demonstrated over 50 years before the Japanese the advantages of the simplicity and lightness of the two-stroke twin. Scott motorcycle production began in 1908 using a patented frame that survived virtually unchanged until the 1930s. The engine was the 333cc liquid-cooled two-stroke parallel twin that the Scott name will forever be associated with. Next we are going to look at two 1931 Coventry Eagle 98cc Marvels. Coventry Eagle was yet another company who produced pedal bicycles before turning to motorcycle production. The machines they produced were usually assembled from bought-in parts, and it seems that the final product was of high quality as they were well received on the market. Between 1899 and 1914 the company experimented with various engines, firstly with a MMC hanging from a down tube. Later they tried Villiers, Jap and Abingdon power plants. After the First World War more models followed. One of the best known was the 1923 V-twin with a 976cc JAP or Jap engine. Minstrel and Ree Cycle Club Birmingham, who early last century were known for their cars, decided to expand into motorcycle manufacturing, and they chose the mark Calthorpe to market their machines under. The first Calthorpe made its debut in 1909, and like the company's cars it had a white and poppy engine. The model we are looking at here is a 1932 Ivory Calthorpe Major 500. The Ivory range was the best known of all Calthorpe machines. Earlier, we looked at two Excelsior motorcycles built just after the turn of the last century. This one is a little younger. It's a 1932 148cc Excelsior Pioneer. Excelsior had a reputation for well-designed machines, and I think this one is a fine example of their Between Wars range. Here we have an aerial. This is a 1930 Model B 550cc. In the early 30s, Ariel could boast that the company employed three of the best designers of their time, Edward Turner, Val Page and Bert Hotwood, but Val Page was soon to leave to join Triumph.
Model J 147 1932, owned by Alfred Hutt from London. Very nice, sir. Thank you very much. That's a pretty little bike there. Roll the brass shining.
And here we have one of the Triumphs Val Page designed for his new employers. This is a Triumph Model Z 147cc. As well as this lightweight, Page also designed new 250, 350, 500cc overhead valve singles, 350, 550cc side valve singles, and a 650cc overhead valve vertical twin. However, this range didn't do as well as expected, and Triumph hit financial difficulties. Eventually, in 1936, the company was bought by Ariel. Now under new management, Edward Turner moved in as Triumph's new chief designer. He revamped Val Page's earlier range, and with more chrome and a new name, Tiger, they were an immediate success.
Number 40, this time we got a beautiful old flying Scott, completely restored by Russell Andrew from Newton Abbott.
This is another Scott motorcycle. This one is claimed to be the best of the Squirrel range. It's the 1929 Scott Flying Squirrel 500cc. Scott, who as I said before was a great innovator, had patented a form of caliper brake as early as 1897. He also developed a fully triangulated frame, rotary induction valves, and was responsible for the first motorcycle kickstart. His first two-stroke twin engine dated from 1904. Scott died in the early 20s at the young age of only 48, and he said that after his death the company lost its heart too.
Utility number 1, 147cc, owned by Bob.
And here we have another Excelsior. This time it's the 1929 Excelsior Utility number 1, 147cc. Around the time this bike was manufactured, the company was starting to gain success in competition with lightweights, coming first in the 1929 lightweight TT with Leslie Crabtree riding. Then came the Depression, but Excelsior battled on, and in the early 30s an Excelsior just failed to capture the world record with a Silver Comet powered with a 1000cc Jap V twin. However, they did manage to reach a speed of 163 miles per hour or 262 kilometers per hour. Excelsior's most famous machine was the Mechanical Marvel. This one, the 1933 lightweight TT, with the fastest lap of 72.62 miles per hour or 116.87 kilometers per hour. But because of the world's slump, Excelsior sales still failed to improve. The company forged on with varying success, but failed to reach again the heights of its heyday, and eventually, in 1964, the company that launched the first motorcycle in this country in 1896 ceased trading.
This time, 296cc 1929, owned and restored by Gerald Pascoe from St. Column down in Cornwall. Morning, Joe. Joe will own that little rally for lots of years, found under a galvanised sheet. Number 41 this time.
The Crimean War, during which the Charge of the Light Brigade took place, was the seed that brought together 14 gunsmiths to produce arms for the British forces, and BSA, or British Small Arms Company, was founded. In the 1880s, the company began to make bicycle parts, and in 1903 saw the first BSA Minerva-powered two-wheeler on our roads. It was not until 1910 the first all-BSA model was launched. This was powered by a 499cc side-valve single engine. For most of its life, BSA was to be Britain's largest motorcycle manufacturer, and after the Second World War it was to become the largest in the world. In 1960 the company was able to report profits of over £9 million. So what went wrong? I'm sure you all know. In hindsight it is easy to gloat, but like everyone else in the British motorcycle industry, BSA failed to see the threat from Japan and the technical advances they were making, enabling them to produce cheap, stylish new motorcycles. By the 70s, huge profits were turned into losses, and in 1972, BSA was finished.
We're back to the parade anyway, that old BSA, where we finished. Now we're coming on to number 35. This time we got a Triumph Model N Deluxe 500. Thank you, sir, 1927. That one is owned by Barry Leach from East Cornwall, East Sussex, and we got a 46 AJS 16M 350cc.
Here we have an AJS. Joe Stevens and his four sons went into business in 1900 producing engines, and in 1910 the first AJS motorcycle made its debut. AJ with the initials of Joe Stevens' eldest son, whose name was Albert John
we're coming on to a classic, a nice old Norton 1934.
Now we come to a 1934 Norton International 30 490cc. From 1932, the International that came onto the market was a TT replica fitted for the road. The forks were changed and the frame was made shorter and lower than the CSI. A large tank with sporting lines also became an International hallmark, adding greatly to the bike's looks. Top speed was about 100 miles an hour, not bad for the time, and all in all the Norton International was a stylish, fast and popular motorcycle, and only the start of the Second World War brought production to an end. Here's another famous Norton. This time it's the 1937 ES2 500, and it's a bike a lot of people have fond memories of. The ES2 had a long production run that ceased in 1974. Norton's production started in 1902 and lasted nearly 100 years before it finally fizzled out. Back at the museum, here we have another rare classic, a 1907 Rex 3.5 horsepower. It has a single-cylinder side valve engine and a single gear belt drive transmission. Its price new in 1907 was 24 guineas. Rex began as a car manufacturer in Birmingham in 1899. The next year they moved to Coventry. It was there the two brothers, Billy and Harold Williamson, who started the company, moved into motorcycle production using their own power plants. Being another innovative company, telescopic forks were introduced in 1906, which probably helped to Rex come third in the very first Islandman TT. In 1911 the Williamsons lost the company when it was taken over by George Hemingway, and production was to continue until 1933. The Rex here was called the Light Rex. Improvements it boasted on earlier models are footrests as well as pedals, and a comfortable riding position with the seat positioned well back and low down. This 1909 269cc torpedo was made by Frank Hopper & Co., another bicycle manufacturer. Between 1907 and 1920 a variety of models was produced, mostly fitted with precision engines, both single and twin. However, the motorcycle you are looking at now has a Minerva engine. It also retains the pedalling gear, and you can see from the general flimsiness of the machine it retains the bicycle manufacturer's influence. The rear brake is pedal operated and works on the rear wheel belt rim. The lightweight side valve Minerva engine has magneto ignition and a B&B carburettor. Drive is by single gear direct belt to the rear wheel. Its price new in 1909 was £37.
In the West Country this year with a Model 8 Sunbeam 350 1936. That's Dave Johnson from Loughborough. Morning. Another nice old 350 Sunbeam there. Number 68. This is owned by John Fisher from Beckles in Suffolk. Beautiful bit of work, sir. Thank you very much. Number 75. This time it's an OK Supreme 250 1939. Owned by David Beer from Exeter in Devon. Very nice, David. There you go.
And here we have another machine manufactured by yet another company that started as a bicycle maker in 1882 and was called OK when it began making motorcycles in 1899. Production went on until 1939, and this bike was produced in the company's last year. It's the OK Supreme 250 utility machine and was OK's final model. OK had a varied history and could boast some good results in competition.
Number 71 this time. We got a beautiful Brough SS80 1000cc 1938, owned by Ken Baxter from Pontypridd in Wales. The Rolls Royce.
This is a rare Brough Superior SS80 1000cc motorcycle. The standard finish of the Brough Superior was so exceptional Rolls-Royce didn't disapprove of their slogan that the Brough Superior was the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles. Many famous people owned Brough Superiors. One of them was Lawrence of Arabia. He had 700 SS machines and had his 8th on order when he was killed. George Brough, who said he rode his first motorcycle at the age of 10, first joined his father making Brough motorcycles, but he was not satisfied with either their quality or their speed, so George set up his own works in Nottingham in 1919, and in 1921 he produced the first bike called the Brough Superior. In 1923 the company launched the SS80. This one is a 1938 version. When the range first came onto the market, with it you got a written guarantee saying that it had been timed at 80 miles per hour or 129 kilometres per hour. In the 18 years Brough Superior motorcycles were manufactured, only about 4,000 were built, so I think that makes this a pretty rare machine.
Now we're coming on to another nice little old machine, a 1938 Coventry Eagle Silent Superb. What 250cc? Oh my rolling.
Now let's have a quick look at a couple more motorcycles at the Dorset Steam Fair. Here we have a 1937 New Imperial Model 23. This one's 150cc. Another company to start production of motorcycles in 1902 was James. This famous James was manufactured in 1938 and has a 125cc engine. In 1938 too, James started to produce the Autocycle with the 98cc Villiers engine. This was good timing for being tremendously economical. Over 6,000 were sold during the Second World War. 125s like this one were also produced for British Army dispatch riders. The last motorcycle we are going to look at in Volume 1 is this 1913 Abingdon 696cc twin. Production of the Abingdon began in 1903 by building both medium and heavyweight machines. At first imported engines were used of conventional side valve design. The V-twins was the most successful, particularly in export market. They soon, however, began to produce their own engines, and the motorcycle here in the museum has one of those. After the First World War, production stopped for a while until 1925. At the beginning of this programme I said these machines were called King Dick. Now I can tell you why. Abingdon also produced a popular adjustable spanner which was nicknamed King Dick, and so in 1925, when motorcycle production began again, the new machines were also called Abingdon King Dick, or AKD. The King Dick name, it is said, was taken from a public house near the works. Abingdon eventually ceased motorcycle production in 1933. Well, the Abingdon brings us to the end of Volume 1, which I hope you have enjoyed. We shall be looking at many more vintage and veteran motorcycles in Volume 2.